You want to make sure your truck is level so you can get a proper reading when filling your diff with fluid. Also, you want to make sure you add friction modifier if you have a limited slip differential. I'll discuss that later in the video. Let's begin. First, let's make sure we can remove the fill plug before taking the cover off. If you can't remove the fill plug, then there is no reason to drain all the fluid out of the diff because you will have no way to refill it. These fill plugs can be difficult to remove, so I grabbed this pipe to give me extra leverage. You need to use the end of a 3/8 inch wrench, preferably with a 3-inch extension like I have here. Make sure you slide a drain pan underneath just in case some diff fluid drips out after removing the fill plug. Once you break it free, you should be able to take the pipe off and remove the plug the rest of the way. You never know if the fluid was overfilled from the factory or from someone else, or if you just aren't on level ground. After you remove the plug, go ahead and check the level by placing one of your fingers straight into the hole. As you can see, there is some oil on my finger, which means I did not lose a lot of fluid, which is a good thing. Now, if you take a look at the magnet at the end of the fill plug, you should notice it has some tiny metal particles in it and hopefully nothing more. If you have bigger metal shavings on the end, that could mean something is wrong and may cause serious issues down the road. So keep that in mind when changing your fluid. Go ahead and screw the fill plug back in about halfway so you don't have to search for it later. And then we can get on the other side and start removing those diff cover bolts. Alright, go ahead and make sure you still have your drain pan underneath of the differential. You may also want to grab something to shield the wind like a cardboard box or something else. You will see why I mentioned that shortly. Now, there is an ABS line that runs around the diff cover, and there are 3 clips holding it in place. These just pull right off. You can tell the difference between these bolts and the other bolts that hold the cover in place. Just remember where these 3 are so you can put them back in the right place when you are reinstalling the cover. I will go over this later. Go ahead and push the ABS line up and over so it's out of the way. It should be able to rest just like that. Now, when removing the bolts, make sure you leave one in place to prevent the cover from falling and splashing diff oil all over you and the ground. I'm going to leave this one in place. So grab your 1/2-inch socket and begin loosening the diff cover bolts. Mine has 12 of them. You are going to need a deep socket for the 3 bolts that held the ABS line in place, which you will see me grab in a little bit. Oh, and take a picture of the differential with your phone so you know where these 3 longer bolts go later when you are installing them. You don't need to remove these in any particular order, but later when installing the bolts, you will need to follow a certain sequence. I'll go over that later as well. As you can see right here, my shallow socket could not remove this bolt, hence the reason why you need a deep socket. Now, you will see me grab my 1/2-inch deep socket and remove the remaining bolts. I even removed the one bolt I planned on keeping in place by accident, so just make sure you screw it back on. The RTV will hold the cover in place, so it's not a big deal if you accidentally do the same. Alright, now you want to grab a scraper similar to this. I made sure to grab a 3-inch in width and also stiff so the scraper doesn't flex too much. So the trick here is to find a spot where you can wedge the scraper between the diff and the diff cover. You can remove any old RTV that may be loose. You don't have to focus on the bottom either. You may be able to wedge it around the side somewhere. Just be patient and refrain from using a hammer to force the scraper between the two. That can cause big gouges in the surface and will most likely cause leaks later on. Alright, so I was able to get the scraper in just enough right here at the bottom, which makes perfect sense considering this is where the leak was coming from. You want to move it around as much as you can, again without using any kind of force. Eventually it should pop free, just like that. Now would be a good time to grab the cardboard box or something else to block the wind from pushing the oil from hitting you in the face. You will see the oil flying everywhere once I completely break the seal from the old RTV. So now the seal is broken and there is the fluid going everywhere. If you were wondering, no, it does not taste very well. Moving on. Go ahead and let it drain until you notice there is not a lot of fluid coming out anymore. This is a good time to go ahead and remove that diff cover. Even though the cover isn't heavy, make sure you use 2 hands to prevent it from falling into the old lubricant, into your drain pan, and splashing everywhere. Once that's out of the way, you can start wiping around the edges to remove any loose RTV that can be removed by hand. I highly recommend you cover the internals of the diff with a rag or an old shirt. You will see me do that a bit later, but it's good practice to do it before wiping anything down because you want to prevent any foreign matter from getting inside of your diff. These components can handle some old RTV, however metals are a different story, so just cover it up to be cautious. Also, there's going to be a decent amount of old lubricant buried down here, so just pull it out with a rag or paper towels like I am doing right here. You want to remove as much of the old oil as possible. Your oil will probably look darker than mine, but remember I changed this about a year ago before losing all the footage after filming. Now, you can grab your scraper and very carefully scrape the mating surface to get that old RTV off of there. You can try to use plastic scrapers. I used them about a year ago, but I will be completely honest with you, they aren't very good. The concept is good because you don't want to scratch the surface, but they do not do a good job removing all of the old RTV. I could be wrong, but I think other YouTubers talk about these plastic scrapers to prevent their viewers from messing up their own differentials. So I completely understand why they bring it up. However, I did not have any success with them, and I want to make sure I mention that. I'm going to do my best to try to explain how I use this metal scraper, and we'll discuss ways to prevent messing this up, so hopefully none of you have any issues. You want to make sure the scraper is flush with the Diff's mating surface. If you are on an angle, you will dig into the surface and scratch it very easily, and that could lead to leaks, which is not what you want. Also, there's something I haven't done yet that you definitely need to do. Can you spot it? If you guess covering the gears inside the differential, you would be correct. You want to keep these free of any debris for obvious reasons. Just keep working the scraper around the surface. There may be areas that look clean, but somehow more RTV keeps coming off. These areas just have a small amount, but you still want to get it off to prevent any uneven surface, which could lead to leaks. Once you feel like you have completely removed the old RTV, go ahead and pull the rag or towel out. Since I waited too long to put the rag in there in the first place, I'm going to give the gears a quick wipe down to remove any debris that may have fallen in there. Then, go around the mating surface with your fingers and see if you can feel any high spots, or spots that feel like there could be some old RTV left behind. If you do feel something, grab your scraper and try to remove it. Mine feels pretty good, so I'm done using the scraper on this surface. While I was doing all that, more of the old lubricant fell to the bottom of the differential. So I'm going to grab my rag again and try to absorb as much of the old fluid as I can. I just pushed the rag in like this and worked it around the differential gears. Once I removed all that I could, I moved onto the diff cover. Now the first thing you want to do is clean the back of the cover. So just grab yourself a rag and wipe it down. That looks good. With most of it clean, I grabbed my brake clean and sprayed it down. This will help remove the rest of the old fluid / grease from the cover. You will see me clean it up even more later on, but in the meantime, let's start scraping that old RTV off of the mating surface. I started with the larger pieces of the old RTV first, as this was the easiest to remove. Oh, and if you notice, there is a large portion of the old RTV on the inside and outside edge of the cover. Do you remember earlier when I mentioned mine was leaking and that one potential cause was from pushing the cover back on too hard? Bingo. That's exactly what this looks like, doesn't it? If you push too hard, the RTV will naturally squeeze out in two directions. Let's continue. Once all of the bigger sections of the old RTV are removed, you want to keep the scraper as flush as possible with the mating surface. It's slightly more difficult compared to removing it from the differential because this cover will keep moving around on you. I would not use a bench vise on this unless you have a set with rubber ends to prevent damaging the cover. Regardless, it's the same process. You want to go around the cover and remove as much as you can, again while keeping the scraper as flush as possible. I cannot stress enough how important this is. At this point, if you ruin the cover, you are better off buying a new one instead of trying to make this one work. Deep gouges will cause the diff to leak, and then you will have to start all over again anyway, so keep that in mind. Periodically, the end of the scraper will be full of old RTV, so grab your rag and wipe it off. Now is a good time to use the rag to remove the RTV from the cover. Then, get back to scraping. If you have a drill and a wire wheel, that can reduce the amount of time you spend doing this drastically. This took me around 10 minutes to remove, which isn't a big deal, but still a wire wheel would have removed the old RTV in a couple of minutes at most. Either way, both methods get the job done, and that's all that matters. Once you have removed the old RTV, go ahead and grab your brake clean and spray it down. With a rag or a towel, wipe the cover down to remove any loose pieces from the RTV. Now I don't have to worry about removing old RTV ever again. Watch this. Here is the lube locker gasket I'm going to install instead of using RTV. Let me show you why these work and other gaskets don't. As soon as my camera adjusts here, you can see there appears to be 3 layers. 2 rubber layers on the outside, sandwiching a metal layer in the middle. Let's begin by placing the gasket onto the cover. You want to make sure the holes line up perfectly. Now let's flip it around and see if the gasket is symmetrical. Look at that. Some of the holes do not line up. If you notice the holes in your gasket do not line up with the holes in your cover, go ahead and flip the gasket around and see if that helps. Sometimes the solution is that simple. Now, in order to easily get the cover and gasket back on the differential, I'm going to insert 2 of the bolts into these holes right here. Make sure you grab the correct bolts because if you remember from earlier, there are 3 bolts that extend out to hold the ABS line in place that runs from side to side. You will notice the longer side is on the driver's side and the smaller side is on the passenger side. And make sure you don't pinch that ABS line either when putting the cover back on. This is as easy as just pushing the cover on and then tightening the bolts down by hand. Once they are tight, go ahead and get the 3 longer bolts tight so you don't forget later on where they are supposed to go. If you listened to me earlier, go ahead and look at the picture on your phone on the placement of these 3 bolts. On my truck, one was right here, and then you can skip one opening and insert another. And then the same thing for the last bolt. Skip one slot and then insert the bolt. That's where all 3 need to go on this differential. Now you can grab the rest of your bolts and screw them all in by hand until they won't turn anymore. Once all the bolts are in, go ahead and go over all of them one more time to make sure they are hand tight. As you are tightening the bolts, it will gradually push the diff cover in further, leaving a gap between some of the bolts. So just do it one more time to get everything flush. Now I'm going to grab my torque wrench and then torque these bolts down to 15 foot-pounds. You want to do this in a crisscross pattern to make sure the pressure is distributed evenly across the cover to ensure the gasket is being squished evenly. Alright, now that every bolt is currently at 15 foot-pounds, we now need to get them torqued down to the proper torque spec. Mine calls for 33 foot-pounds. So just like before, go ahead and torque them down in a crisscross pattern. Perfect. Now I'm going to go over each bolt, but this time I will do it in a circular pattern. This will ensure every bolt has been torqued down. Just like that. Okay, so looking at the diff cover, you can see where the leak was. I do not want that to stay there or else I won't really know if I have another leak. So I'm going to grab my brake clean and clean it off. Now, if I have another leak, I will know right away, which is a good thing. Now, after putting my drain pan back under the diff, we can remove the fill plug. Since I removed this earlier to make sure it would break free, it was easy to remove by hand. You are going to want to clean off the plug to remove any debris or metal shavings that may be on it. There aren't any big metal pieces on mine, so I know there was no damage from the leak. Removing all of the debris from the plug will ensure the magnet can work at its highest potential, so don't skip this step. I cut between 4 and 5 inches of clear tubing with 3/8 inch inner diameter and a 1/2 inch outer diameter. Before we get into why I chose this specific tube size, let's remove the cap and cut the end of the diff fluids bottle. You can use scissors or the sharp part of a pair of pliers like I am using right here. Oh, and if you don't use all of the fluid, you can just push the cap back on like this to store it for the next time you change your diff's fluid. Let's get the diff filled. You want to position the tube like this, and the reason you need between 4 and 5 inches of tube is because of the ledge right here. This is really the only obstacle that's in your way, but it's definitely in the way. Now push the tube onto the end of the bottle like this, and then you want to quickly push the end of the tube into the fill hole of the differential while you flip the bottle upside down. Kind of like that. But you also want to remove the seal under the cap or else nothing will come out. Let's try that again. Put the tube over the bottle's end and then flip the bottle upside down while pushing the tube into the fill hole. There we go. Now we can see the fluid going into the diff. This fluid is pretty thick, so go ahead and squeeze the bottle to speed up the process. You can see the clear tube not only allows you to see the fluid, which is convenient in itself, but also fits very snug over the end of the bottle, preventing any fluid from spilling out. Now you want to keep squeezing it until fluid starts leaking out, just like that. I like to squeeze the bottle a little bit more after I first see it leaking to ensure it is really full and I did not accidentally pull the clear tube out too far by accident. When you start seeing the fluid drip out at a faster rate, then you know it's full and you can remove the bottle. The best way to check the fluid is to stick your finger in the hole and then see if any fluid touches it. As you can see, there's fluid on my finger, which means the fluid is at the correct level. So we are good to go. Now I'm going to wipe off the fluid that leaked out and then we can move on. Okay, so you want to apply some kind of thread sealant to the thread of your fill plug. I personally like this sealant from Permatex. Go ahead and remove the cap and then wipe the brush along the side because you don't need very much of it. You are just trying to very lightly coat the threads. When you start applying the sealant to the threads, don't overthink it. Just act like you are painting something, just like this. Once you get full coverage, go ahead and put the brush away and then use your fingers to really push the sealant into the threads. Now you can screw in the fill plug and get it finger tight. Before moving on, make sure you change out your gloves to prevent the sealant from getting all over your torque wrench. Now we can torque the fill plug down to 22 foot-pounds. And don't forget to use that 3-inch extension to help get to the plug. It's kind of awkward trying to keep the extension in the plug, so use your other hand to stabilize it if you need to. Perfect. Now you are done. Well, not quite. I drove around for a week without connecting the ABS line because I completely forgot about it. So make sure you put yours back in place. It's simple. You just need to push all 3 caps back onto the 3 longer bolts on the diff. Just like that. Let's talk about one last thing. Remember when I talked about adding friction modifier earlier in the video? This only needs to be added if you have a limited slip differential. It's easy to figure out if you have an LSD. Just go to your local Ford dealer or call them and give them your VIN number. They can figure it out for you. And since you will need to buy fluid anyway, you might as well just ask them while you are there. This is very, very important to add, or else you will experience premature wear and will need to rebuild the parts inside of your diff if you drive too long without friction modifier. So make sure you talk to your local Ford parts salesperson. That's all there is to it. If you found any part of this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button as well as the notification bell so you don't miss a video from our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.